Hello, everyone. Welcome again to another episode. Today with John Graham, third appearance. We're going to talk about a very interesting subject related to weaponry and country security. So, John, welcome again. How are you today?
I'm fine. Thank you very much, Julio. I'm glad to be here, even to discuss such a serious topic beginning with the holidays. But yes, it's an important topic, and I'm eager to discuss it.
Very nice. Thank you so much again for making this appearance. So, John, could you tell us a bit about yourself and your past experience in this specific area?
Yes, I some years back, I'm not actively involved now, but I was in the U.S. Foreign Service, not just as a diplomat, but I spent some time working as a U.S. diplomat as part of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And not only that, but within NATO, I was part of NATO's nuclear planning group, which is a super secret small agency with all the with the NATO nuclear powers participating, and we would meet secretly in castles in Switzerland, castles in the UK, or in some place in Norway or whatever. And we would sit down and try to figure out how to defeat the then Soviet Union in a nuclear war. Yes, your listeners and viewers might think it's crazy, and in a sense it was, because the whole idea of the nuclear planning group was that the allies, the NATO allies, could fight and actually quote win a nuclear war, which was insane because it was very apparent that from Hiroshima and Nagasaki that even one nuclear bomb could have to create enormous devastation, and that both the Soviet Union and NATO each had thousands of nuclear weapons, each one of which was way more powerful than the bombs dropped on Japan to end the Second World War, so that a nuclear war would essentially annihilate the planet. However, that didn't stop us from planning it. So I learned a lot. Most of my job was about targeting nuclear weapons, not making them. I wasn't a technical person. So we spent a lot of time trying to target nuclear weapons. It's interesting. The basic strategy, and I don't think I can. I'm breaking any great secrets now, so many years later. But the great strategy was that the NATO nations, their strategy was to have a wide variety of types of nuclear weapons, including very small ones that were much smaller than, in fact, the nuclear weapons dropped on Japan. Uh, um, but they were still devastating, and we had many of them. And we told the Soviets that if the Soviet Union used its land army in those years, of course, there was a Cold War and an Iron Curtain. If the Soviet Union came across through the Iron Curtain with a land army, and NATO was losing the war with conventional weaponry and soldiers, tanks, artillery, etc., that NATO might use these small nuclear weapons. These were so small that the impact was not would not destroy a city, but it would certainly take out an army base or a column of advancing tanks or whatever. So NATO's strategy was lots of small weapons, big weapons too, but small ones that we could use before the Soviets used nuclear weapons, because they would come with a land army, and we would hit them back with. If we were losing, we would hit them back with nuclear weapons. Now, on the other side, the Soviet Union didn't have any weapons like this. All they had was huge 50 megaton city busting weapons, enormous weapons, way bigger than anything used in the Second World War, one of which would take out an entire city the size of Chicago or Moscow. And they told us that if we used even one of our small nuclear weapons, they would reciprocate with a huge nuclear weapon thrown at one of our NATO cities, London, New York, Los Angeles, whatever. And so there was a standoff. Each side was afraid to start the nuclear war because of what happened. We were afraid that they would make good on their threat and that if we started a nuclear war or used even a small nuclear weapon, they would make good on their threat to throw a huge nuclear weapon at Chicago and start World War III. The Soviets were afraid that we could win a land war in Europe with these precise small nuclear weapons that would destroy their land army. So there we were. It was a crazy situation. And it was called Mutual Assured Destruction, MAD, because
Amazing.
that was, and that each side held off because it was afraid that it would start World War III. So for
John,
40,
I have a question, and many people, I think they would have also. What was the point of creating ICBMs? I mean, because in the end, we're talking about mass destruction weaponry, which does not do anything positive to people, the world, or the countries, only really destruction. So why creating something to force people to bend, as in to power? Because in the end, what it does is you have a strong arm using a mass destruction weapon, but not as in like democratically. I mean, you're forcing mindset to go as in like a forced way. Why did this all started? I mean, why creating ICBMs? Just generally, why all countries that actually produce ICBMs? Why all these created these programs? If you can tell us that.
well, it's nothing new. It's what's been happening since the beginning of time. In the beginning of time, people fought each other with rocks and stones, and then weaponry began to develop. In the First World War, the introduction of the machine gun at places like Verdun completely changed the aspect of warfare, making it far more devastating than for example, the wars in Europe in the 19th century or the American Civil War, where you had to, with large muskets that fired one bullet at a time. First World War, you had machine guns that fired many bullets at a time, and of course, it was devastating. Then came the advent of new weaponry, kept improving. And by the Second World War, the weapons were much more modern. And of course, by the end of the Second World War, America had developed the biggest weapon of all, which was a nuclear weapon. And we dropped it on Japan because the alternative would have been to invade Japan with a land army, land and naval forces, which would have killed upwards of 1 million people, most of them Japanese, some of them American. And so instead of doing that, we had the nuclear weapon and we dropped it on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's completely changed the nature of warfare. So now, end of the Second World War, America is the only nation with nuclear weapons. And so therefore, for a short time anyway, we could lord it over, we could dominate the rest of the world. But soon the Soviets developed their own nuclear weapon. And in the beginning, the weapons were crude and the ICBMs were short range. They didn't work very well. But we kept improving. The Soviets kept improving. And we were all trying. It was called the arms race. And if you remember, back in the days of the American president, John Kennedy, he won the election because he convinced America that we were losing the arms race. So the answer to your question is it's an arms race, and it's been that way forever. And as long as there are humans with big brains and smart people, they will develop better and better weapons, in this case, nuclear weapons, and in this case, rockets or ICBMs that were so sophisticated that one rocket could carry perhaps 10 nuclear weapons and drop them separately on 10 different cities. And then each side had thousands of these rockets, each one more powerful and more accurate. In the beginning, ICBMs were not accurate. You were lucky to hit something within 5 miles of where you were aiming. And now, of course, with precise weapons, nuclear and conventional, we can practically drop a nuclear weapon into a garbage can or a basketball hoop. I mean, the accuracy is drastically improved. Other aspects of improvement have been, for example, in nuclear submarines, making them completely silent so they can creep up on the coastline of an enemy without being seen or detected, because new technology allows them to move, making no sounds whatsoever. I'm talking too much, but I mean, the answer to your question is it always has been an arms race. No nation has been willing to say, okay, I'll stop the arms race, because we're afraid of that if we do, we will disarm. So we've been staring at the Soviet Union and now Russia for decades now, each of us with a huge nuclear arsenal, a bit smaller because there has been some arms reduction talks, but nonetheless, still thousands of nuclear weapons. And we both have them, and we both can easily point them toward the other cities or armies anytime we want. So the same thing happens. We have mutually assured destruction, neither side willing to act because we don't want to start World War III, which would destroy all of us.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I got your point mainly, but my other focus is okay. You have extremely bright people and intelligent designing all these weapons. Why not putting those efforts designing something that would actually help human beings positively? You know, that was my main path. Because I mean, I believe that in the end, all these efforts are to destroy. You're putting huge efforts and very bright people to use things for the. Why not putting to the other side? You know, that was my other perspective.
Well, it's a very useful perspective, and it's a very healthy perspective. It's just that it's never been followed because human beings aren't capable of following it. It's utterly insane what we're doing. I mean, believe me, because I was in the, if you will, in English, it's called the belly of the beast. I was in the middle of nuclear war planning. And I was in the middle of strategies that would kill millions of people. So I got to see exactly how bad it was and how foolish and how insane it was. But it didn't keep us from doing it. Unless you can somehow make the world a pacifist world, it's not going to stop anyone from doing it. Yes, I agree with you, Julio. The world should abolish all nuclear weapons. In fact, if it was me, I'd say we should abolish all weaponry, and we should have peace treaties that respected international borders and resources, and stop killing all these people. I mean, what's happening to the people in Gaza, for example, or the people on both sides in the Ukraine, or now in the Sudan, and God help us, it keeps happening. But it's been that way forever. There's records going back 10,000 years of people fighting each other. So it's not like it's a new thing. And so if you or some other people with your brains and your great heart, if you can figure out a way to stop people from fighting, then God, then thank you, and the whole world will thank you. It just hasn't happened.
John, what do you think that makes people, spend these huge amounts of? Because we're talking about programs that to design all these, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars equivalent anywhere. What would make them to change? I mean, we're talking about, would it make them to change if programs to develop people, education, and countries will make them the same return of investment? Let's just say, this is very cruel to say it this way, but how would you change people that making decisions, spending all this money, creating all this mass destruction weaponry, which year by year, of course, they implemented new technologies, they had updates. So we're talking about extra expenditures. But what was, the main purpose? Because, for example, if you design a program that will develop the end of starvation, for example, in Africa, you'll be doing a huge and massive, great thing. But I mean, designing a weapon, what is it going to do? I mean, this was my main story. I mean, billions and billions and billions and billions are being spent, but the end result is none. So why not creating things that would get, a positive impact to people, countries, and of course economies? Because in the end, you'll get a return of investment. So
Well,
this is my main point for the mentality, because I've been trying to understand why spending so many billions in something that will get no return of investment. So that's my question.
it's everybody's question, and we can answer it. I mean, the same way. Right now, we're dealing with human nature. The U.S. Pentagon, the U.S. military machine, spends almost $1 trillion a year, and a good hunk of that is for nuclear weapons, ICBMs, and rockets. The same thing is true in Russia. And now the European nations, including the UK, where you are, also spends somewhere on the order of 2% of its gross national product, all of which could be used to truly help people. I mean, look at what's happening. For example, the newest crisis is in the Sudan, where they say it could be the biggest humanitarian crisis ever. Okay, well, solving that, bringing enough food into South Sudan and peacekeeping troops and whatever would cost a pittance. That would cost on the order of, I don't know what, 30-40 billion dollars, maybe, not trillions of dollars. We could solve so many of the world's problems with just a small fraction of what is spent on nuclear weapons. So your question is, and my question and everybody's question is, why the hell do we keep doing this? Because all we're doing is ignoring the great problems of the world that are killing already millions of people through starvation and the terrible impacts we see on the people of Ukraine and Gaza and the Sudan, and God knows what's going to erupt next in terms of wars. And we keep doing it. And when we say to our own people, well, why don't we stop doing that in the United States? Because there's some real poverty in parts of the United States, in the southern states of the United States. There's some people that are really poor, and spending a few tens of billions of dollars into new programs to bring doctors and medicines and food supplies and whatever to some of the poor parts of the United States would be a great idea. And the answer to that is, we can't stop spending on nuclear weapons, because if we stop spending, the other side won't stop spending, and then we'll be in an inferior position. And if we give away all of our weapons and start spending all that money to uplift poor people in the United States or in the Sudan, if we do that, the Russians won't do that, and they'll soon have a preponderance of nuclear weapons, and then they can truly threaten us. For example, in Ukraine, that if you don't do what we want, we'll drop a nuclear weapon on you. And if we have disarmed in order to take care of some pressing domestic food problem, then we have no defense. So that's what's going on. If we can't do this, we can't do what Julio Verissimo is saying, because if we follow his advice, then we will soon be naked, we will soon be disarmed, and our enemies will then shove us around, and we can't do that.
John, as another question, is there an organism, international organism, that regulates the amount of ICBMs that are produced yearly? Is that really strict, if it exists? And how do they regulate it?
Yes. There have been. It's not so much the organization, but the peace treaties and the arms limitation treaties, of which there have been quite a number. The Soviets and the then Soviets, now Russians, and NATO have embarked on certain treaties that have limited the amount. So yes, we have gone from maybe 15,000 nuclear weapons. Perhaps it's now down to 6,000 nuclear weapons. So yes, we have definitely placed some limits on nuclear weapons, but if we're now left with 6,000, I think it's about 6,000, maybe it's 4,000. Anyway, if we're left with, say, 4,000 nuclear weapons, let's say 2,000 on NATO's side and 2,000 on Russia's side, well, even one nuclear weapon, even 3 nuclear weapons is enough to destroy everything, and we have 4,000. So the limitations treaties are useful, but they're more symbolic than anything else, because there are still plenty of nuclear weapons, plenty of ICBMs, and the most dangerous things of all are the nuclear submarines, which both sides have, because they're completely mobile. They can be here 1 minute and the other side of the ocean in the next week, and they're completely silent now, so nobody can defend against them. And the new missiles take only 20 minutes to reach from the launch point to a target on the other side, whether it's a city or a group of army divisions or whatever.
Sure.
So that's what we're dealing with. And the answer, again, we keep coming back to the answer, as far as I'm concerned, from so many years of being in this business, is that human beings have simply got to change their nature. I mean, how many times have people been standing up and saying nuclear war is crazy? Nuclear war is crazy because even the people that aren't killed with a huge blast effect will die 10, 20 years later of radiation.
Yeah. The effects on the food, the climate, the environment, the expansion of radiation is far more, even I would say, even almost as dangerous as the blast itself, because it lasts for many, many years, and people will be like in that decadence for a huge amount of time. Well, we had this resemblance from Chernobyl. It was not an attack; it was a blast from the actual facility,
Yes.
and we could see the results even after 60 years or 70 years after. There's still some effects on the area. So, but like I said, I think human beings do not learn from their own mistakes. Even this is what makes me think a lot, because I think me and many people, we already saw what happened through a mistake. It was not a war. It was a blast that was a mistake, human mistake, and we saw the results. So we keep on producing things on purpose that will make 100 times worse than that. So I mean, what did we learn through the history? I mean, that's how human beings being behaving. So,
Well,
John, moving forward, what is your analysis of today's countries? I mean, there's several, conflicts around the world right now. One very critical, as we all know, Ukraine, Russia, that's been involved. All the countries in NATO. What will be your analysis of all this, and regarding, of course, strategic capabilities from one and the other?
yes. Well, I don't know if we're leaving the topic of nuclear weapons because they're always there. But I just wanted to say one more thing before I launch into this,
Sure.
and that is, it really comes down to human nature. Even if there weren't nuclear weapons, it comes down to human nature. We humans like to fight, and we've always fight. There have always been wars. And to get down to it, you have to deal with the very question of violence, including violence in our own cities and violence within even our own families. I mean, if you have a disagreeable relative coming over for a holiday dinner and there's a fight that develops over some domestic political dispute or something, and people start shouting at each other, and this difficult uncle begins shouting at your cousin, and your cousin shouts back at the uncle, and then you get in, and maybe someone overturns a chair, and we're dealing with human nature, but it's got to change. There's got to be a way to deal with conflict right down to the level where conflict starts, which is individual human interactions. And I think that what I really want to say is that each one of us has a responsibility, because we're always in a conflict. I mean, there's hardly a day goes by when there's not an opportunity for conflict. Perhaps someone cuts you off at a traffic stop, and moves ahead when he should stop. Or perhaps it's someone who, I don't know, who had cheated you in a business deal or something really small. Or perhaps it's a teenager who has just done some terrible things, and you have to punish the teenager, and the teenager doesn't like it. Well, all these things are conflicts, and this is how conflicts start. This is how we learn to fight. This is how we learn to accept violence as a way of solving conflict. All I'm saying is that this is where it starts. It starts with human nature, and any way we can to diminish this. Some people think that you can do it through organized religion. You're a Catholic or a Muslim or whatever, and your religion says that fighting is not good. Well, big deal. It hasn't stopped religions from fighting. In fact, some of the biggest wars, the most violent wars, have been fought because of religion. So I'm not sure that religion is an answer. I think it comes down to each of us looking into our hearts. And the next time we see an opportunity for conflict, perhaps because some other driver has cut you off, and instead of saying, you goddamn blankety blank, 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 you think, oh, okay, that's not good. We should have better traffic laws. Or perhaps that person is rushing to be home in time for dinner, and he's ignored the traffic signal or whatever. But some way of minimizing the way we think about fighting, and it's really hard to do because we're all wired to do that.
I think I agree totally with your analogy. And what I would advise to people in high places is that they should think with their cold-minded and in common sense. And instead of trying to be competitive in a way of talking, not be competitive in a way of enfrontment to see who has more or who is best by force. I think democracy and speech should be the first weapon.
Well, you're a businessman, and you're a very good one, and you're a very good entrepreneur, and you know perfectly well that it's possible to compete in the business world. You develop a better product, you develop a better way of selling it, you try to sell more of the product than your competitor, and you do so without trying to kill anybody. If you're successful, your product sells more, and you gain more return. If you're not successful, then perhaps you better make a new product or improve your product, or come up with a new idea
Sure.
for succeeding in your business endeavors. But it doesn't have to end in violence. But often the smallest altercations escalate, and that's the problem with nuclear war. As I said like 20 minutes ago, even if nuclear war starts with using a very small weapon, one that is, say, the size of the Hiroshima bomb or even smaller, it will soon escalate. We did war games. War games are when you plan a imaginary war,
Sure. Sure.
as another side plays the enemy, and you go at it and see what happens. Well, I played in a lot of war games where we tried to simulate warfare, and we would start each war without using nuclear weapons, and usually we would take some hot spot. In those years, it was like Yugoslavia. And we would take a hot spot, and we would start some minor altercation. Minor, I mean, like the First World War, as we all know, started with the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand in Serbia, and World War I started out of a single assassination. Well, we would do the same thing. We'd start a war game with an assassination, for example, or perhaps the theft of an important product or an important secret, or just two rulers who didn't like each other doing foolish things, and then within a day there would be an expansion of that conflict. They would use bigger weapons, more powerful artillery, perhaps. And then within 2 or 3 days, one side or the other would use the first nuclear weapon. And they would say, oh, I'm just going to use one nuclear weapon because I can't seem to stop this.
Well, the main point is that I mean, we're talking about nuclear weapons. I'm just going to use one. It doesn't matter if you use one or big or small. The damage is massive. I mean, the impact's going to be there. It's going to be obviously the start of a mass destruction event. And I think, on my perspective, and I've been totally open to whoever hears here. It doesn't matter if it's government, whoever is in power. I would say being common sense. It's not like pressing a button just because you don't like the other person. I think always dialogue should be in place on the table. And even if it's not progressing that fast, everything takes time. I mean, the world was not built in one day. But of course, it needs to be built with patient people and open-minded people and people which are open to dialogue. Because my perspective is right now there's 5 conflicts, I think, critical conflicts in the world. And how did it came to that? Well, it came to that from my perspective from 5 things. Try to gain more power, greedy, more money. But in the end, none of these apport to human society. So my main question has been over the years was how people, which I think from my perspective and their actions, without common sense, get in such strategic positions in the way even to think that it's good to create a conflict like that. It's I think there should be more regulatory, but not just, as you mentioned, like people are like voluntarily doing peace treaties to restrict the production. No, I'm talking about a real restrict international organism that will enforce as a police or something like this that will actually forbid and stops everything in the specific country that is overproducing. This is just an example what I think it should be done, because the result of what we having is abuse of power. I mean, for example, the conflict of Ukraine is very clear. What was it created for? More land, the restoration of the world, the USSR. Why? Because of one person. Because the mind is to gain more power, more land. This is what I'm talking about. I mean, I think things should be done in common sense and really using democracy. And I think all this came to because there were no people with open dialogue in between or capability of doing a really democratic, conversation, negotiation between the two parties. This is my perspective. I mean, what do you think?
No, it's a good perspective. But let's take the example. Let's take the example of Russia and the Soviet Union. It's a good example.
Sure.
Let's move back 30, 40 years, and the Cold War is finally ended, and you have an opportunity there where people of goodwill might have said, "Look, the Cold War has ended. The Iron Curtain has come down." And we're all tired of this ceaseless violence and threats of violence. We have so many nuclear weapons on one side or the other. It's a very dangerous situation. But now we have an opportunity to build a better world. It's kind of like after the Second World War, when the world did assemble some really fine leaders in Europe and the United States who really tried to make the world safe forever by starting things like the United Nations, for example, and the Marshall Plan that helped put Europe back on its feet so as to avoid the problem of a lot of desperate people starting World War III in Europe. So where are these people? They didn't exist. Our own president, Mr. Clinton, I don't think he had the vision to do it. On the other side, you had chaos. You had a series of weak Russian leaders who didn't have enough power or smart or whatever, didn't have the vision. Same in Europe. There were no great statesmen in Europe. So what happened was we immediately went back to what we knew, which was conflict. On the NATO side, NATO said, well, now that the Cold War is over and the Soviet Union is kind of in disarray, they're weak and they're disorganized. They're trying to find a new way of governing themselves. So let's take advantage of that by pushing the boundaries of NATO toward the Soviet Union, and so grabbing territory while we can. Well, that was a really, in my view, extremely stupid policy that was exercised in those years by the United States and NATO. Basically, it was a policy of kick them when they're down, when in point of fact, what we should have said to ourselves is, look, they're down, but it's a great chance for us to create, for example, a United Nations that would really have teeth, to create a Security Council that really could stop wars, we could rearrange things and invite Russia, the new Russia, and the new states of Eastern Europe that used to be in the Warsaw Pact. We can invite these nations into a collaborative venture based on economics and trade. And we can really make an effort at making a global peace without warlike blocs like NATO and the Warsaw Pact. We could have done that. We didn't do that. On the other side, the Russians didn't do any better. They had an opportunity to find some real leaders, and instead they found some idiots, quite frankly, people without the vision to lead them. And
I believe back then there was the conflict of Afghanistan, right? They were in
no, that was before that. Afghanistan was before that. I'm talking about the fall of the Cold War in the mid-90s.
Sure.
As I just said, NATO's mistake was in kicking Russia while it was down, which just made the Russians more fearful. And on the other side, Russia failed to develop its own leadership, and instead it gave over leadership to gangs of wealthy business people, so-called Russian oligarchs, that began running the country and running it through puppets like oh, well, now it's Mr. Putin, but he's been there for a long time. And so Mr. Putin and the oligarchs began to take control in Russia. They were already mad because of what NATO was doing. So the opportunity, I think, Julio, existed for 2 or 3 years. 2 or 3 years, that's it, in the mid-90s, to create a new world, the same way we did after the Second World War ended. And yet neither side, not the NATO side, not the Soviet side,
They had the proper tools to create that opportunity while we have a window gap, let's just
that's
say.
right. It wasn't so much the tools, it was the vision. It was the vision. Because it took courage to say, okay, we're going to really stop fighting. We're going to get rid of nuclear weapons because there's no longer any use for them. And we're going to start with a new United Nations with some real teeth in it. So when small wars start, we really can stop them by having all kinds of peacekeeping mechanisms installed. We can do this, and at the same time, we can compete in trade, for example, the same way that you and business people do today, international trade. And we can make everything more prosperous. And that, by the way, leaves us a whole lot of extra money that we don't spend on arms, that we can spend for our own people, or better yet, we can try to eliminate disease and poverty in places like Africa.
Exactly.
We can reduce the situation in places like the Congo or the Sudan, so that people aren't so desperate that they stream into Europe and making the Europeans frightened and starting all kinds of tensions in Europe because of the migration crises, because of wars and devastations and poverty in Africa and in our side of the ocean in Latin America. We can do all these things. We could have done all these things, and we didn't. And so that was, in my view, the huge mistake was made in the 90s. Then
would you think to continue this analogy? Would you think that we will have another window like this in the near future, that we can all starting rethink a new strategy? Would you think that will exist another opportunity?
I don't see it coming now. I mean, look what's going on in the Ukraine. Do you think Putin is going to stop? He's not going to stop. And do you think NATO is going to say, oh, we give up. We're going to let you take over Ukraine, even though we know that the next thing you're going to do is attack Poland and Lithuania and Estonia?
No,
NATO's never.
I think it's a very complicated situation. I think it's something that he has to go on the table on direct talks with, I think, Mr. Putin to see when it's going to stop, because in some point it has to stop, because if it's not financially, it's going to be by resources or by actual tools or whatever. It will run out. I mean, it's not possible to continue like this.
You're more optimistic than I am when you say someday it's got to stop. I don't see that coming, Julio, because as we've been talking for half an hour before, warfare has been around since cavemen were through rocks.
No, I don't mean that way. I mean this specific conflict. I think in the end, it will stop somehow, because they are isolated. I mean, being isolated, even if you produce so much, it comes to a point you cannot produce so much by yourself. And I think it will come to a point that everyone will sit on the table to try to decide. Of course, pulling out from Ukraine is totally out of nonsense, because if we do that, of course, it will take over. Then you try to take over the smaller countries like Moldova or even Poland or whoever it is. And in the end, it become on a more serious threat for NATO. But in the end point, I think it's because when there was conversations, when there was on the table, I think the perspectives and mindset and the proper knowledge of negotiation was put in place. I would think so, because there was a lot of conversations, but I mean the results were and from my perspective, what I thought and what I know, was kind of nulled. And I think that was a perspective of wasting a lot of time and resources in something that I think everyone knew from the people that were involved that we had no result. So, yeah.
Yeah, there was, there was a way to deal with the Ukraine crisis through negotiation. It wasn't that the Russians didn't have a point. For example, in Crimea used to be part of Russia for a long time, and then Khrushchev basically gave it to the Ukrainians and some goodwill gesture 35 years ago. And then the Russians now took it back. But Crimea has always been bouncing around between Ukraine and Russia back and forth. So it's not like
Sure.
it's a completely new grab. And then the other thing is that we don't like to talk about it, but for quite a long time after the end of the Cold War, Ukraine was governed by some very corrupt people. And the people in the eastern part of the Ukraine were Russian speakers. Not Ukrainian speakers, and they were always under some Russian influence. For one thing, because the area called the Donbass in eastern Ukraine had a lot of resources, and it was right next to an industrial section of the Soviet Union that could use the resources. So there was a robust trade and economic relationships between eastern Ukraine and western USSR, and it was peaceful. But at the same time, the Ukrainians in Donbass, in eastern Ukraine, weren't happy with the government in Kiev, because the government in Kiev was not only corrupt, but it tended to shortchange eastern Ukraine in favor of western Ukraine. In other words, the tax monies went largely to projects in western Ukraine, that is to say, Ukraine oriented toward Europe.
Sure.
And not enough of it went to the people in the Donbass. So the Donbass, eastern Ukraine, was a poor part of the country, and there were a lot of really dissatisfied people in eastern Ukraine, all of whom spoke Russian, all of whom with deep ties to the Soviet Union. So when Russia attacks, it wasn't like they were immediately the enemy. They had a lot of friends in eastern Ukraine. So there was a great opportunity for some negotiations. Either a new government in the Ukraine that could have said, okay, we're going to completely revise our attitude toward eastern Ukraine. We're going to give them more civil rights. We're going to make sure they get their fair share of tax money. We're going to eliminate some of the things we're doing now that disadvantage Russian speakers. We're going to make it more equal, and we're going to treat eastern Ukraine the same way we treat western Ukraine. And there was certainly a way to do that and make a deal with the Russians so that the conflict between eastern Ukraine and Russia would remain an economic conflict, an economic competition, because that's what it should be. Resources in the eastern Ukraine, raw materials, industrial factories and stuff in western USSR, a robust competition, maybe even aligned with the common market. There were plenty of ways to do that. But then the Russians...
John, why do you think this didn't happen? Is because there were no... well, I'm going to be very open. There was no capable people in power at that moment with that capacity of having the proper judgment and the proper mentality for this type of negotiations? Or is it because they really didn't want it and they forced it to make it this way?
I think it's the first. I think in both sides. I think in Ukraine they had some miserable leadership until Mr. Zelensky came along. It was one corrupt president after the other who didn't have the common sense or the vision to see the danger of shortchanging the people in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass region, by treating them as second-class citizens. He was inviting an invasion by the Russians. There wasn't anyone with the intelligence and the vision in the Ukrainian leadership to do that. On the other side, the Russian people allowed the gangs of Russian oligarchs to take control of the country and install a person like Putin, and Putin wasn't just an unscrupulous leader.
Yeah.
He also was, in his own way, a patriot in thinking that he wanted to return Russia to the greatness of Peter the Great and Empress Catherine the Great,
Sure.
and to go back to a Russia that was a huge power in the world. Putin has always said that. So they allowed him to come to power, and now he's taken complete power. There seems to be no way to get him out of power. And he's a real threat. Well, it didn't have to be that way. The Russian people had opportunities 20 years or so ago, after their last failed president, Mr. Yeltsin, his name was. After Gorbachev was an aberration. Gorbachev was the one good leader that Russia's had in a long, long time. And
Yeah.
Gorbachev understood that the future of Russia had to be with an accommodation, with and a way of living together with the West. Russia didn't have to join the common market, but Russia could at least compete fairly under a system that prevented war and allowed both sides to compete economically through industrial might and trade. Gorbachev knew that, but he was bypassed. And then some real idiots like Yeltsin came to power, and then Yeltsin gave way to really dangerous idiots like Putin, who is basically grab power and will keep power forever until he dies, whether someone finally kills him or he dies of natural causes. But the Russians,
I think the history taught us, I think to all of us, things that should not happen. People in power with no capability of being there, or having common sense or leadership, because in the end, to be a leader is not about you forcing people to follow you. Being a leader is having people to follow you by their own will, knowing that what you're doing is correct, either for country, for people, for environment, whatever reason there is, but there has to be one.
I mean,
That's why.
I have a lot of sympathy with the Russian people. I curiously enough, Julio, I think the Russian people are more like the American people than anybody else in the world. I mean,
They are. They are. I honestly tell you public because most people don't know. I lived in Russia 2.5 years, two and a half years, and I saw that. I mean, even the culture in some cities more developed, like Moscow, St. Petersburg, Sochi, which was my main city. The people have this openness to the Western culture because that's what they want. They want that same kind of liberty, that same kind of environmentally that can do and have the same opportunities as in the West. Now, of course, they are dependent on the people who are in power, and this was the big problem all the time for the unfortunate situation for the people in Russia. The citizens in Russia are always dependent on people in power that usually, or most of the times, besides Gorbachev, as we just mentioned, are not capable of doing ideals for the people and the country. They do ideals for their own benefit, for their own thoughts, and not thinking in the country at all. And they do say that they're doing for the country, which, I mean, there's no motive. There's nothing in really there that was done for the country in many ways. So this is a big frustration. Yes, population really want to have different type of government and mentality, but of course they are forced to follow the leadership of the government because they are the way they are and the way the system in there is built or was built, because it's a total chain. There's a chain of command, and everyone coming there to below is like they have to follow it because it's the rules they implement, and this is what I think they want to change. Not I think. I mean, I know they want to change this, but they don't know how to.
Yeah. Well, again, I think in all countries, I think a lot of it depends upon the levels of education of people. You need people who are educated and who have access to good information. And when education is allowed to be diminished, and when people don't have access to balanced information, that's when you get people like in Russia now who are, I don't want to say brainwashed, but still all the Russians here is Putin's side of the story. I'll call it propaganda because that's really what it is. And they don't hear the other side. And yet, as far as my experience is like yours, I mean, the Russians are fine people. They're intelligent. And like I say, they're more like Americans than even the Frenchmen or the Italians. My Russian friends that I have are at the United Nations, for example, were wonderful people. One of my best friends at the United Nations happened to be a member of the Russian intelligence operation, for God's sake. He was just a fine guy, and we really enjoyed each other and had lunch together. And it's like it's a matter of people having the education and then having the leadership so that you can produce Gorbachev at just the right moment. Or you can produce Yitzhak Rabin, for example, who 30 years ago came really close to a two-state solution, which would have permanently, I think, solved the problem in Israel-Palestine by developing, back when it was a real possibility, developing a situation in the Middle East where you had a Palestinian state with a functioning government and with good leadership right next to an Israeli state with good government and good leaders. And maybe you had a UN force or a barrier in between to keep the peace. But nonetheless, it was certainly possible in the two-state accords that was almost a reality back in the days of the U.S. President Clinton. But it didn't happen because of the intransigence of Yasser Arafat. In this case, I think one has to fairly blame the Palestinians for blowing the opportunity. God knows the Israelis have a lot of faults as well. But what Yasser Arafat did to destroy the possibility offered by Rabin was a monumental mistake that has made the world a whole lot less safe ever since. So that's the Middle East. And then we were talking.
John, would you think that we'll be able to create world peace again? Would you think that would be possible to do it? And I mean, what kind of tools do you think? Tools, I mean, as in people and mechanisms, would it be needed, in your own opinion, of course, to make this happen? I mean, because I don't think nothing is impossible. I mean, if you put your effort into it, and if there's a will from both sides, it's doable. I mean, I think my question, the question of many people is, would we ever will have world peace again? And how do you see the world in the next 3, 4, 5 years?
Yeah, I think it'll take something that we would now regard as a miracle. I mean, but they do happen. Look what just happened in Syria over the last 2 weeks. Who would have thought? Who would have thought?
Yeah.
Assad would disappear and he'll be replaced. Now, who knows who these new guys are? But they're certainly going to be better than Assad. And the whole balance of power in the Middle East has changed. Iran has much less power. Turkey has more power. It's all shifted. That same thing can happen. Let's say, for example, that for some reason Putin disappears from the scene. Maybe the man has a heart attack. I don't know. Okay. And then someone steps forward. Well, it's not going to be Navalny because he's dead. But there are plenty of other smart, patriotic Russians that are hiding out now. Either they're outside of the country as emigres or they're inside the country. It's possible that there's another, not possible, it's almost certain that there are other Gorbachevs in the UK. And on the other side, the Western nations have got to do a better job at producing leadership. I mean, in the UK, for example, you had 4 prime ministers in a year or something or whatever, and some of them totally incompetent. I don't know what this new guy Stormer is going to do, but it doesn't seem like he's made any great breakthroughs. And here in my country, I'm on to the left of center as a politician. I think that America has made a huge mistake in putting Donald Trump back into power, because he will only make things worse. But we do have elections. There will be an election in another 4 years, or for our Congress in another 4 years.
John, what makes you think the judgment of people? I mean, of course, I mean, I'm not talking about in the matter of judging people, but what I'm talking about is what makes them do this mindset, because they already had the experience of having a person in power, which is Trump, and they saw everything that has happened. Why do it again when you know we had the bad? I mean, I go through the Einstein theory. Don't expect to do the same thing over and over again, expecting that you have a different result. I mean,
Yeah.
I think this is goes same way, right?
I think it's because Americans are afraid, and they don't have the tools to deal with that fear. Now, what are they afraid of? We're the richest country on the planet. What are they afraid of? Well, the price of groceries is double, for example, because of inflation. So they're afraid that they won't be able to pay their mortgage payments on their homes, or they're afraid for other economic reasons. And now we become so polarized, they're afraid even to talk to someone that used to be their friend, but is now on the other side of the aisle in terms of politics. They're afraid for their friendships. The communities are breaking down. The institutions that used to hold America together are breaking down. The churches, for example, have become, if anything, a force for evil rather than a force for good in many cases. And it's all because people are afraid. We have got to build up a sense of confidence in people so that they can do what you
No,
said.
but I mean,
They can develop. They can
being
develop.
I think following your analogy, I think being afraid, of course, the uncertainty. I think right now uncertainty exists everywhere in the world, not just in US. I mean, everywhere. I think there's a big uncertainty everywhere. But the main point is why going through with you know a possibility that you already knew from the past what happened, and they choose to go it again, no, trying to think that would actually solve the issues when they know in the past it was not solved. So why, this is my question for me to try to understand, because sometimes I don't understand really the politics or how some voting are really done, really. So that's, yeah, my analogy.
Well, several reasons for that. I think the biggest one is poor education and poor communication in the United States. We our access to good, balanced news has become extremely limited in the United States, and I think also in Europe. We are prey to social media of the worst possible kind. The worst kinds of charlatans and crooks and liars have a huge platforms on our social media networks. And so
Sure, sure.
some people, including, for example, my two brothers-in-law, all they do is listen to Fox News. That's all they do. They listen to one side of it, and Fox News is full of lies from the morning to the evening. It's one lie after the other. And if all you do is listen to Fox News or even worse sites on social media, then you come to believe that it's true. Someone else has said that if you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes the truth. Well, I think that's true. That's what.
Yeah, I do believe in your analogy. I think people overhearing the same thing over and over again, I think they realize that it may be truth. But I mean, I always say one thing: a truth will never be a lie, and a lie will never be a truth. So I think in there's a gap, a huge gap, let's just say, between the common sense of a human being of analyzing the situation, because you have the tools. There's internet, and internet there's a lot of information, bad or good, but you can analyze it, and you can see yourself in common sense what can be real and what cannot be. I mean, you check one news and you go to Fox, for example, but you can go to other channels and check if that news exists.
There's
Then
another
you can see by yourself. So this is just a trying analogy of people. I think they should have more common sense in a way. I'm not talking about just having more cultural knowledge. Of course, that helps. But I mean, in today, there's also some tools that you don't need to be highly educated to follow your common sense. And I think this is the main gap that is missing. I think it's the circle of the system itself between people makes them busy a lot of hours of the day, and they don't have time to be well informed. And then when they have the time, they miss the opportunity of using common sense for certain situations to realize what will be the actual truth or not. I mean, this is my analogy from my perspective.
No, your perspective is a good one, and I will say we've not mentioned one thing that I think in many ways is the most important, and that's quite frankly money. What's happened especially in the United States, but also elsewhere in the world, is that there's been a growing gap between rich and poor, and especially in the United States, that's created enormous tensions. There's been an increase in wealth in the United States, but not the 95%, 99% of that increase in wealth has gone to make rich people richer, and only 1% has gone to the middle and lower classes in America. And that's what's really fueled the tensions. I mean, for example, you do have a lot of people, mostly in the American South, who are quite poor. And who really have to decide whether or not to pay their rent or to buy groceries every week. And at the same time, we have people like Mr. Musk, who's just been hired by President Trump as an aide, who have close to $1 trillion in income, in wealth. I mean, hundreds of billions of dollars. What are they going to do with hundreds of billions of dollars? Why they could, Mr. Musk alone could end poverty in America. And yet he doesn't. And so a lot of people, including middle class people, and certainly people, lower middle class people, people that are making a hard time meet, they're scared because of economics. They're scared because they're getting poor. And they're scared because it doesn't look any better for their generation, their next generation. It looks worse. It used to be when I was a young man, it was just given as a fact that all of us young people would have lives better than our parents. We would have better housing. We would have better cars. We would have better access to health care. And that's the way it was. Every generation was better off than the one before. Now people look around and they see with their own eyes that the subsequent generations are worse off than before. Their children, their grandchildren will have lives that are less prosperous, less happy, because most of the money, that 99%, has gone to make rich people richer, and that's the real problem. And the other problem is that the Progressive Party in America, the Democratic Party, has been ignoring this for a long time. That's why Miss Hillary Clinton, for example, lost the election to Donald Trump the first time around in 2016, because the Democratic Party didn't understand or appreciate what was going on among about a third of the people in America who were really having real problems with the economy. And you could see that their livelihoods were disappearing. And the Democrats just didn't pay enough attention. But who paid attention? Donald Trump paid attention. And he built a great political base from disaffected, angry people, mostly white middle class people. And he was able to blame Black people and brown people, Mexicans and immigrants, and African Americans for all of America's problems. And if you combine this with poor communications, people accepted what Trump said, and they blamed immigrants for poverty. They blamed Mexicans. They thought the Mexicans were criminals and rapists and all the other absurd things that Trump was saying. But the core of it, and this is what people really have to understand, the core of it was inequality. And until we get rid of or reduce inequality, nothing is going to improve. So we need.
I think was the propaganda in the misstep of inequality and diversity. They use that by their own means to get where it took them back then. I think that's the analogy that we could say about it. So, John, was really wonderful. We've been talking 1 hour. As usual, it was been an amazing conversation. I really enjoyed it. I think everyone that will hear this, I think will have at least, I hope, a better perspective of what's going on around the world. And how things and events had started in our past, and to make everyone think. Don't repeat the same mistakes over and over again. In order to maintain order and peace, it's needed to have the proper people in place and be open-minded to other cultures too. So, by closing up, John, what would you say as a power message to all the events around the world? What will be your last words of this show?
My last words are it's to each and every person listening. I'm speaking directly to you now. It's up to you. It's up to us. You have to deal with these situations at a personal basis if you hope to have your leaders deal with them. There's an old saying that when the followers start leading, the leaders will follow, and this is true for us too. So the next time you have an opportunity to deal with something with an inequality, for example, in dealing with some poverty issue in your hometown, do it. The next time you have a chance to tell a friend of yours who is a racist that your own experience of America as a non-racial society and a society that welcomes black, brown, yellow people, whatever, do it. Do it to make your own life and that of your family better, and only then will you make your countries better.
Absolutely, I wouldn't agree with you more. Just to finalize, I think that analogy should be the one that everyone should have in order to have the proper society. It's like, for example, in my own time. I mean, when I was small, I even remember when I used to use the bus or even my car, and we drop people on the street. We used to say good morning, even if you don't know, even if you don't gonna see this person ever in your life. But we used to talk to people in a matter of having an open society and highly polite. In these days, this has changed so dramatically that even if you go on the side step and asking for some information, people take you for something very strange. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone understands the proper perspective of this show today. That be open-minded. If you are somewhere, try to understand other cultures, and of course, if you understand them, they will then understand you. Don't
Yeah,
force a position. Don't force a position that is not needed to force.
yeah.
There has to be a dialogue. There has to be a conversation, and there has to be fluent communication both sides. If it's just one side, it will not work. So that's my analogy of
No,
today.
you're right. But again, I mean, change starts with each individual heart. Change starts from within each individual heart. If you want better leaders, then you have to create better leadership in your own life, in your own family, your own community. Then it can get better. If you look for the truth in balanced sources of news, for example, then everybody else will start looking at similar truths and they'll stop believing the lies. But you have to start yourself. You have to start yourself by questioning faulty
Absolutely.
news, by dealing with racism in your own neighborhood. You have to start there. Then you can fight for success on a larger sphere, elect better leaders, better policies.
Absolutely. John, it was great to have you here. Thanks again. Looking forward for another subject in the future for us to talk. And as for us, hope you enjoyed this episode and see you again tomorrow for the next one. I
All right.
appreciate it. Catch you later. Thank you.
Thank you.